And it also seems like it's not, it's, well, talking about the transgressiveness, not just towards, with the cruelty towards children, it's just, so hard to think about even, but it's just that it's so, if the culture and society is so safe that it enables writers and readers to go into this fantasy world, this world that's just, divorced or, separate from, what they will get when they close the book. And so
I think that's right.
So we have in the pregnancy diary story also the food, the grapefruit jam, and in this story, pregnancy diary was also published in New Yorker as well.
Right.
So.
And that's actually the story that won the Akutagawa Prize, which is the top literary prize in Japan. It's also a new writer's prize, so it put Ogawa on the map in the mid-90s. I don't know what to say about the food. It was easier over dinner to talk about the food. She's clearly, well, in some ways I would go back to the same line of thinking with cruelty to children. Japanese culture, and we can see this up and down the avenues in New York, is a culture obsessed with food to begin with. There are more food shows on television, there's more attention to food, there are more restaurants in Tokyo than any other place on the planet. In addition to which, Japanese treatment of food has always involved kind of sacred, profane, pure, and impure notions, going back probably to Shinto. And food, a sushi shop is only as good as its hygiene, really. The best sushi shop I've ever eaten in Tokyo, the author who I mentioned, who's since passed away, of this first novel I ever translated, took me to this was the 1980s, so the figures are meaningless, but even in those days it was an $800 a person sushi lunch in the Ginza, and it was an absolutely plain room with no ornamentation and a plain piece of cedar planking that was so clean that it was almost painful to sit in front of it. And I do think that there is this sense that the sort of fetishizing purity of food, then to thematize rotting food becomes a kind of transgression again. And the description of the rotting scallops in the story that I've just reread, or the rotting cream puffs that poison the little girl in the diving pool, is really, it's disturbing to read in any culture, but my sense is that in Japanese culture that the notion of a rotting cream puff is so revolting. Right. If you've been in a Japanese pastry shop, you know that they're works of art.
Yeah, that would be horrible. Yeah. That would be horrible. I guess, I mean, and I know that, you don't have a lot, nobody really has very much access to Ogawa-san because she is so immersed in her work. But, there's a very distinct loneliness, a thread of loneliness that pervades all of these stories. And I mean, again, it's that, the question of the author and the narrator, but, because she's so unknown, right. I mean, how is it that, what might be your take on, sort of the relationship there?
Yeah. I have only met her once, I have to say, and it was again in a wonderful sushi restaurant in Kyoto for lunch, and very, very clean. And she's a very private person. She doesn't make appearances. She, like her predecessor Murakami Haruki, who does come to this country but is never seen on TV in Japan, who is something of a hermit in his own country. She is not a media star the way that Kirino is, for instance, or Ryu Murakami. And because I only had this one, it was a very quiet lunch, I must say. And I do have the sense that these narrators, the narrative voice that she creates for all three of the stories in Diving Pool, less so in the new novel that I'll read a piece from in a second, but in most of her previous fiction, this somewhat repressed young woman who stands at a distance from the action of the story and observes it very carefully and very beautifully, but whose emotional commitment to what's going on is questionable, or in the case of Diving Pool, is inverted in a sense, or twisted. I certainly don't project those things onto her personally, but she allows for this because of the vacuum of her.
Right. She doesn't
her. Right.
So, would you like to read?
If that's okay, yeah. I've been encouraged to read. Pardon?
No, go ahead.
Yeah.
I can hold the microphone.
Oh, that's okay. Right. I probably don't even need it. This is. I'm just going to read a couple of pages from this new novel that will be out next month, but you have advanced copies here, called The Housekeeper and the Professor. The Japanese title is Hakase no Aista Sushiki, which translates literally as The Professor's Beloved Formula. And we decided to change the title around for various reasons, but it is the story, this is truth in advertising, of a housekeeper who goes to care for an aging math professor, a math genius actually, and the pages I'm going to read sort of set up the situation, which then plays out as the relationship between this aging professor who has memory difficulty and this young woman and her son who in some ways have to adjust to his rather odd world, but come to have a tremendous affection for them. So it's really a love story between the three of them.
The memory?
The memory, right. That's explained in detail here in the section I'm going to read. So, it was March of 1992 when the Akebono housekeeping agency first sent me to work for the professor. At the time, I was the youngest woman registered with the agency, which served a small city on the inland sea, although I already had more than 10 years of experience. I managed to get along with all sorts of employers, and even when I cleaned for the most difficult clients, the ones no other housekeeper would touch, I never complained. I prided myself on being a true professional. In the professor's case, it only took a glance at his client card to know that he might be trouble. A blue star was stamped on the back of the card each time a housekeeper had to be replaced, and there were already 9 stars on the professor's card, a record during my years at the agency. When I went for the interview, I was greeted by a slender, elegant old woman with dyed brown hair swept up in a bun. She wore a knit dress and walked with a cane. "You will be taking care of my brother-in-law," she said. I tried to imagine why she would be responsible for her husband's brother. "None of the others have lasted long," she continued, "which has been a terrible inconvenience for me and for my brother-in-law. We have to start again every time a new housekeeper comes. The job isn't complicated. You would come Monday through Friday at 11 a.m., fix him lunch, clean the house, do the shopping, make dinner, and leave at 7 p.m. That's the extent of it." There was something hesitant about the way she said the words brother-in-law. Her tone was polite enough, but her left hand nervously fingered her cane. Her eyes avoided mine, but occasionally I caught her casting a wary glance in my direction. "The details are in the contract I signed with the agency. I'm simply looking for someone who can help him live a normal life like anyone else." "Is your brother-in-law here?" I asked. She pointed with the cane to a cottage at the back of the garden behind the house. A red slate roof rose above a neatly pruned hedge of scarlet hawthorn. "I must ask you not to come and go between the main house and the cottage. Your job is to care for my brother-in-law, and the cottage has a separate entrance on the north side of the property. I would prefer that you resolve any difficulties without consulting me. That's the one rule I ask you to respect." She gave a little tap with her cane. I was used to absurd demands from employers, that I wear a different color of ribbon in my hair every day, that the water for tea be precisely 165 degrees, that I recite a little prayer every evening when Venus rose in the night sky. So the old woman's request struck me as relatively straightforward. "Could I meet your brother-in-law now?" I asked. "That won't be necessary." She refused so flatly that I thought I had offended her. "If you met him today, he wouldn't remember you tomorrow." "I'm sorry? I don't understand." "He has difficulties with his memory," she said. "He's not senile, his brain works well, but about 17 years ago he hit his head in an automobile accident. Since then he has been unable to remember anything new. His memory stops in 1975. He can remember a theorem he developed 30 years ago, but he has no idea what he ate for dinner last night. In the simplest terms, it's as if he has a single 80-minute videotape inside his head, and when he records anything new, he has to record over the existing memories. His memory lasts precisely 80 minutes, no more and no less." Perhaps because she had repeated this explanation so many times in the past, the old woman ran through it without a pause, and with almost no sign of emotion. "How exactly does a man live with only 80 minutes of memory? I had cared for ailing clients on more than one occasion in the past, but none of that experience would be useful here. I could just picture a 10th blue star on the professor's card. From the main house the cottage appeared deserted. An old-fashioned garden door was set into the hawthorn hedge, but it was secured by a rusty lock that was covered in bird droppings. "Well then, I expect you will start on Monday," the old woman said, putting an end to the conversation. And that's how I came to work for the professor.